Today's class is called Halakhah for the Ages, reading Responsa from a Bygone era. I hope I'm saying that right. This is the first week of this class. It's Springsman 2024 here at Risha. We're so excited to be together and also be together here with Rachel, Dr. Rachel Furst. Am I saying the last name correctly? Furst? Yeah. Okay, perfect. Sounds good. Just a few words about Rachel, and then I'll say a few words about the class. So Dr. Rachel Furst is a research fellow in medieval Jewish history at the University of Haifa, where she recently relocated from Munich, Germany. She holds an academic degree from Hebrew University of Jerusalem and Columbia University of New York, and has lectured widely in Israel, Europe, and in the United States. And I'm so excited to be together again, Rachel. Just a few words about the class today. Well, the class series, I believe we have 9 classes. Halachic Responsa provide a window into the minds of legal scholars and decisors, and also into the social, political, and religious fabric of the societies they serve. In this course, we will study a sampling of such texts from medieval Europe on topics ranging from organized crime to marital conflict and interfaith cooperation. We will examine these premodern rabbinic rulings with an eye to their legal significance and creativity, as well as their value as sources of Jewish history. Class discussions for the class will address fundamental questions about the evolving and contingent nature of Halakhah and the role of scholars and laypeople in its development and dissemination. Sorry, Israeli here. Okay, and with that, I'll turn this to you, Rachel.
Great, thank you very much. I really appreciate that introduction, and I appreciate the opportunity to study with all of you who are here on Zoom or Facebook or wherever you may be. As Evie said, I'm very happy for you to turn on your screens when you can, to participate when you can, with or without screens. I know that people are, most of you are in the middle of your day. I am, as you heard, located here in Israel, where this is kind of the end of my day. But I know that everybody is in the midst of different things. So please feel free to be as present as you can and to participate as much as you can. And yeah, I hope that we'll have an opportunity to really get to know one another and to learn together over the course of the semester, this spring semester. So you heard a little bit just now, both about, who I am, and I know that some of you are familiar from previous courses and other contexts. So I hope that we'll get to know one another a little bit more over the course of the semester. I won't add too much to my biography right now. I will say, though, that the topic of this class, or I should say maybe the focus of this class, is very close to a lot of the research that I've done as in my academic capacity, as well as to the teaching that I've done in my teacher capacity. So it's a fun opportunity for me to share with you a little bit of the material that I really work with on a regular basis. As you heard from the description that Evie read aloud, and the description that I imagine you have seen when you registered for the course, this is really going to be an opportunity for us to get to know a particular genre of halachic literature, the Responsa genre of halachic literature, and I'll have a lot more to say about that momentarily. But it's also going to be an opportunity for us to focus in on a particular time period in halachic history, namely the medieval period, which is was one of the most really prolific, one of the periods of greatest halachic creativity, whatever ideas people might have about the medieval period in general. Certainly from a halachic perspective, it was really one of the most, the richest periods. So what I'd like to do today is going to really be an introductory class. And what I'd like to do today is to talk a bit about this genre of halachic literature known as the Responsa. We're going to talk a little bit about the different periods of Responsa literature, and a little bit about the legal nature, the legal weight of the Responsa literature within the halachic system. For the coming weeks, after today, we're going to really be each week kind of topically focusing in on different examples of this Responsa literature so that we can really get an opportunity to work with the texts, with the material themselves. So again, whereas today will be primarily introductory, in future weeks, we're really going to be working very textually. And I just wanted to say on a sort of logistical level, today I have a PowerPoint for you, and I'll be working with PowerPoints probably throughout the semester. But I do anticipate that in future weeks, when we really begin to look in a more intense and sustained way at specific examples of the Responsa literature, I know that many of you would probably appreciate having the text in front of you as we begin to look at these texts more closely. And so my plan, at least for now, is that in future weeks, I will try to provide you with a kind of handout in advance of the class so that those of you who wish to either print it out or to have it somehow on another screen next to you will be able to do so. For today, as I said, I'm going to be using a PowerPoint, and I'd be happy to send to Drisha and then have them send to you the slides of this PowerPoint after the class in case you want to have access to some of the materials in the text that we're going to be looking at today. Okay, so without further ado, let me just get up that PowerPoint. Bear with me for one moment. As I just share my screen, please hold on a moment. 1 second, I don't know why I'm having trouble with that. I apologize.
You need help?
No, I don't need help. I mean, I don't need help in theory. Just for some reason, hold on 1 second. I will get it up there.
Okay.
For some reason, I'm not seeing it. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. Okay, I hope that you can now, 1 second, let me get into, okay, I hope that everyone can now see the PowerPoint. Wonderful. Okay. Okay, so as I began, mentioned just a few moments ago, I want to talk for a few minutes at least about this genre known as the Responsa literature, since it's really going to be the focus, the textual focus at least, of what we're going to be doing this semester. Post-Talmudic Halachic literature is often divided into 3 genres or 3 categories. The first of them being commentaries, or sometimes called novellae. Those are texts like, probably most famously, Rashi's commentary on the Talmud or the Tosafist's commentaries on the Talmud from the period of the Talmud and on, starting with the Geonim, and we'll talk in a moment about chronology as well. This was a common genre that really focused on the text of the Talmud itself. The Talmud quickly became, during the Geonic period, I should say, became the kind of canonical texts of Halachic literature, primarily the Babylonian Talmud. And there are many different historical reasons for that we won't go into right now. But because the Talmud became a fixed text sometime during the Geonic period, by which I mean the period from, and these are again very sketchy and rough numbers, but roughly 700 to roughly 1,000. During that period, the Talmud was already perceived as a fixed canonical text, and the genre of commentary, of explication of the Talmudic text really took off as a genre of halachic literature, and that was very much, again, focused on the text itself. It was, to a certain extent, a kind of academic genre, whose goal was really to make the text more clear. The other genre of halachic literature that took off during this Geonic period, meaning the post-Talmudic period, was the genre of halachic codes. And when we talk about codes, and the picture that you have before you is an example of probably one of the most famous of the Jewish legal codes of all times, that of Maimonides, his Mishneh Torah. Codes were an attempt by different scholars in different eras to really kind of encompass sometimes the vast scope of halachic literature, sometimes slightly more narrow and focused segments of halachic literature, but to really provide instruction, to provide a kind of a digest or a straightforward, a user-friendly guide and accessible resource to the halachic literature, which as time went on was becoming more and more vast. Those two genres differ in some significant ways from the genre of halachic literature that we're going to be focusing on, that of the responsa. And I should perhaps say here that in sheer quantity, in sheer amount of writing, numbers of books, if you can call them that, or numbers of pages written, the responsa really take the cake. They really encompass the largest chunk of post-Talmudic halachic literature that has been written throughout the ages. Now, the responsa literature differ in some significant ways from both the commentaries and the codes. The responsa, like the codes, and sort of unlike the commentaries, were really focused on determining the law, providing some kind of guidance for people as to how to live the law. And that way, responsa are closer to the codes than to the commentaries, which, as I said a few moments ago, are more of an academic genre, a genre that's really about explicating the text of the Talmud itself. However, the responsa differ from the codes in some very significant ways. And perhaps the most significant way in which they differ from the codes is that codes are prescriptive law. That is, they present the law as it should be, as it theoretically would be carried out. Whereas the responsa genre of halachic literature is what some people might refer to as case law, as halachic case law. It's law, it refers to, in many events, in many instances, law in practice. It's not about how the law should be, so much as how the law actually was practiced, how the law is interpreted and carried out and practiced in actuality. And we'll see a lot of that as we begin to look at the responsa itself. I want to add to that the name responsa, the term, is the sort of Latinate version of what in Hebrew is usually referred to as the literature, the sifrut of she'ilot utshuvot, which would literally translate as questions and answers. And in fact, that's a very good descriptor of what this literature is as a form of halachic literature, because basically the responsa comprise correspondence usually between halachic authorities. And we'll talk a little bit more about that today as well, but usually the responsa constitute correspondence between halachic authorities that begin with questions posed by one rabbinic author, one rabbinic authority to another, and the response or the tshuva, the answer to those questions. So that's both the format of the responsa literature as well as the content. Now, the responsa literature has a long history. In a certain sense, the concept of responsa, the concept of asking halachic questions and receiving answers that then turn into a source of halakha itself, that really goes back, in a sense, to the Talmud itself. During the Talmudic period, as many of you will know, the main centers of Jewish scholarship were focused in two areas: in the land of Israel, and the academies in the land of Israel were what gave rise to what's known as the Palestinian or the Jerusalem Talmud. And the second center, of course, was in what's known as Babylonia, present-day Iraq, in these towns, in these academies that grew up in the towns of, as you can see on the map here, Nehardea, Pumbedita, Sura, Mechoza, etc. Now, I want to say again a word about, I don't have a timeline for you here. I will perhaps provide a timeline in future weeks. But when we're talking about the Talmudic era, we're referring to a period of time that's stretched from roughly the 1st century before the Common Era through, now the end point is a little bit iffy, but probably let's use for our purposes sometime in the 6th or maybe even the beginning of the 7th century. That long period of time gave rise to the Mishnah, the Midrashay Halakhah, as well as the Babylonian and, as I said before, Jerusalem Talmuds. The Jerusalem Talmud was redacted or complete. The Mishnah, of course, was redacted earliest of all of those, sometime during the beginning of the 3rd century of the Common Era, let's say around the year 225 or so. Roughly around the same time that the Mishnah was redacted, there was another important composition known as the Tosefta. Following that, work began on the Talmudim. The Jerusalem or Palestinian Talmud was redacted, and I'm using the word redacted because there's a lot of debate about whether it was written or not written at this period in time, but it was kind of edited and concluded probably about a century prior to the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud continued to be worked on in a sort of editorial fashion, as I said, well into the 6th century and perhaps beyond that into the 7th and on. And the period after that, those who inherited the mantle of the sages of the Babylonian Talmud were the Geonim, who were themselves also based in, again, Babylonia or present-day Iraq, with additional academies in the land of Israel. So the map that we're looking at now is a map of really that's the most relevant one for both the Talmudic period and the Geonic period that we're going to be talking about now. But as I said a moment ago, before we got into the geography, the whole concept of responsa literature, of again, writing a way to ask halakhic questions and receiving answers that then become part of the official halakha, does date back to the Talmud itself. And so here I want to take a look at 2 examples, although there are many within for example, the Babylonian Talmud, that refer to this concept of, again, of exchange between rabbinic figures, of writing a way, of addressing questions, receiving answers, and then including them within the Halakhic canon. So here, for example, we have a passage from the Babylonian Talmud tractate Chulin, where the Talmud tells us that during the lifetime of Rav was one of the earliest of the Babylonian sages, of the rabbis who were responsible for the Babylonian Talmud. So during the lifetime of Rabbi Yochanan, who was a scholar based in the land of Israel, used to address him thus in his letters, meaning he used to send letters from the yeshivot, from the center of learning in the land of Israel to Babylonia, saying, "Greetings to our master in Babylon." After Rav's death, Rabbi Yochanan, who outlived him, then used to address Shmuel, his colleague, Samuel, the colleague of Rav in Babylonia, thus, "Greetings to our colleague in Babylon." So you may notice, right, a sort of a change in the form of address, right? If he addressed Rav as the master, he now addresses Samuel as simply our colleague. Said Samuel to himself, "Is there nothing in which I am his master?" Samuel was sort of sensitive to this change in terminology, and he therefore sent to Rabbi Yochanan the calculations for the intercalculation of months for 60 years. So he tried to sort of impress him with his erudition, with his learning, as a means of demonstrating that he too was worthy of the title master. To which Rabbi Yochanan responded, "He only knows mere calculations," right? That doesn't convince me. That does not make me think of him as the equal of Rav, the master. So he, Samuel, wrote out and sent to Rabbi Yochanan 13 camel loads of questions concerning doubtful cases of treifa, to which Rabbi Yochanan responded, "Okay, it's clear that I have a master in Babylon. I'm convinced I must go and see him." Okay, there's a lot that we can unpack about this story, but for our purposes right now, what I really want to focus on is, again, the way in which this story provides sort of some evidence for the fact that there was this correspondence, right? And again, as I mentioned previously, this is an era in which much of the Talmudic learning happened orally. But here we have questions and answers, halachic answers that are being written, that are being sent back and forth between these centers of learning, which again is evidence for the ongoing connection, the ongoing interactions between the rabbis in these different centers of learning. That's an important point in and of itself. As well as the ways in which this correspondence literally was transmitted. These camels, these camel loads of questions. This was one of the ways in which the letters and other correspondences traveled those distances in that era. But I think more than that, there is the sense that this correspondence then actually became halakha. And I think that is even clearer in this second example from Babylonian Talmud tractate Gittin, in which the Talmud tells us about Rav Yehuda, who said in the name of Shmuel, again, Shmuel being one of the early Babylonian sages, the resident of a country overseas sent an inquiry to Rabban Gamliel. With regards to people who come from there, meaning Eretz Yisrael, to here, Babylon. For example, someone whose name is Yosef, but here they call him Yochanan, or someone whose name is Yochanan, but here they call him Yosef. How do they write bills of divorce to effectively divorce their wives? And here I just have to add one sort of piece of background information. I said this passage is taken from Tractate Gittin, which is very caught up in all of the details of how to properly write out a bill of divorce. And there's a very strict rules concerning the way in which people, the individuals who are divorcing or being divorced, in which their names are recorded in the bill of divorce in order for it to be considered a kosher get. So here we have a question about someone who goes by different names in different places. And that's the question that is being posed to Rabban Gamliel by the residents of this overseas country. So Rabban Gamliel arose, according to the Talmud, and instituted that they should write the man so-and-so and any other name that he has, the woman so-and-so and any other name that she has, mipnei tikkun ha'olam, for the sake of the betterment of the world. And this is part of a larger discussion of how the rabbis were very meticulous and careful about the writing of these divorce bills so as not to create problematic divorces, situations of agunot and so on, because that was considered, again, really animated by the spirit of tikkun ha'olam. But for our purposes, without getting into the details, this is, again, evidence of the fact that there were these halachic correspondences, that Rabban Gamliel issued a ruling, a decree on this particular halachic matter, and that became part of the canon of halachic rulings, of halachic rules. And so again, when we're talking about the history of the Responsa literature, in a certain sense, we can say that it really dates all the way back to the Talmud itself. However, in the Talmud, whereas it does provide, again, myriad references to this kind of correspondence, it doesn't actually know, the Talmud doesn't know of an independent genre of halachic literature that constituted any kind of independent responsa. These stories are kind of woven into the Talmud, and their rulings are woven into the Talmud. So it's not really, at this stage in time, it doesn't seem to have been a self-standing form of halachic expression. That changes in the period of the Geonim, which, as I said, the Geonim were, in a sense, the inheritors of the sages of the Babylonian Talmud. This is the period, and again, when I refer to the period of the Talmud, the period of the Geonim, we'll be talking about the period of the Rishonim. These are ways, it's what historians call periodization. These are kind of schematic ways of breaking up long historical periods and kind of making sense of them. Perhaps at some later date, we'll talk about the implications of referring to these historical eras from the vantage points or from the perspective of halachists, which is what we're doing when we call these the Talmudic period, the Geonic period, the Rishonim period, etc. But for our purposes today, certainly, that's just a helpful way of breaking down these eras and recognizing their distinct features. So again, when I refer to the Geonic period, I'm talking about the period from roughly the year 700 to roughly the year 1000. During that period is really where we can kind of locate, recognize the birth of Responsa literature, as mentioned beforehand, as one of the three primary genres of post-Talmudic halachic writing. Now, we have different sources for the history of the Geonic academies, for what we know about the way in which Halakhah was promulgated, the way in which Halakhah was studied, the way in which Halakhah was disseminated in general during the Geonic period. And one of the classic sources for that is a passage known as the missive or the letter of Rabbi Nathan the Babylonian. And this is also the source for much of what we know about the way in which responsa literature was created during, again, these early days, this period of the Geonim. And I want to say a word about this source. Rabbi Nathan the Babylonian is a figure about whom we don't really know very much, apart from what he reports in this text itself. There have been all kinds of attempts by scholars to kind of connect the author of this text, this figure, with other individuals who appear in literature from the era. But in point of fact, we really don't know much about him. What we do have is this text that was originally, as you can see here, composed in Judeo-Arabic, as was much of the Halakhic literature, most of the Halakhic literature during this Geonic period. Again, the Geonim were, they were based first and foremost in Babylonia, in, again, present-day Iraq, where Judeo-Arabic was the lingua franca of the Jews. And during this period, interestingly, because we're going to see that in later periods, halachic writing in general and the writing of responsa in particular was almost exclusively in some kinds of rabbinic Hebrew. But during this Geonic era, the primary language of rabbinic dialogue and discourse, including of the responsa, was Judeo-Arabic. This text was composed sometime in the mid-10th century, so we're talking about 900 something. And it's about a 4,000 word text, so not a tremendously long text, that talks, it has two distinct sections. One section talks about the institute of the exilarch, which was the political leader of Babylonian Jewry, and the second section of which really talks about some of the main institutions of Babylonian Jewry, among them the Geonic academies or yeshivot. Nathan the Babylonian presumably traveled to Babylonia and was a witness to some of what happened in these Geonic academies or yeshivot. And in that context, he provides the following description, which again is one of the primary sources for what scholars know, what we are able to reconstruct of the history of these major institutions of Jewish learning. Now, I will add that from a historical vantage point, some aspects of Rabbi Nathan's missive, or this text that we have in front of us, are a little difficult to verify. So there is some question about the historical accuracy of everything that he reports. But with that caveat aside, this still is certainly a very compelling description of how the Geonic academies ran. What he describes, and again, presumably he was a visitor and saw this himself, is that the Geonic academies used to gather 2 major times a year. Over the course of much of the year, the academies were apparently kind of sparsely attended. Most of the scholars who studied in the academies were home making a living, being with their families. But twice a year, in the month of Elul and in the month of Adar, they would gather in these centers to study together with the other scholars, and primarily with the Geon. The Geon, I should have said this beforehand. The title Geon was an honorific title that was given to the head of the academies in Babylonia during this era. And so he writes as follows: they gather and come together from everywhere in the Kala month, which is the month of Elul in the summer and Adar in the winter. And during the 5 months since the previous Kala, each one of the disciples had been diligently studying at home the tractate that was announced to them by the Rosh Yeshiva when they left him. Right, so the curriculum for the coming semester was set at the end of the previous semester. Then everybody would go home and study the tractate diligently, and then they would come back and kind of review it or learn from the Geon together in these 2 months of the year. And they would all come and sit before the Roshei HaYeshivot in Adar and Elul, and the Rosh Yeshiva, that is the Geon, supervises their study and tests them. And this is the order in which they sit, and I didn't include all of the text here, but there's a very detailed description of how they used to sit in these 7 rows, like the kind of classic ancient Sanhedrin, very hierarchical. The Geon was at the head. All of the official disciples would sit in these 7 rows, and behind them would stand all of the students who didn't even qualify as the official scholars of the academy. And when the head of the academy wants to examine them, I'm back in the text, concerning their study texts, they gather around him in the 4 weeks of the month of Adar, and he sits, and the first row recites before him, and the other rows sit silently. And when they reach a point that is obscure to them, they discuss it between themselves, and the head of the academy listens to them and understands their words. And when he finishes his reading, he recites and expounds the tractate and explains in the course of his exposition the point that the students have debated. And sometimes he asks them the explanation of laws and expatiates to them on the meaning of each law until all are clear to them. Thus they did all the days of the month. So I want to pause here and just ask you, from listening to this description of what's going on in the academy, the ways in which the Geonic Academy was run, what strikes you as being the nature of the relationship between the Geon and the disciples? Again, the disciples who are scholars in their own right, as well as the perhaps the less senior students. Any thoughts about, for those of you who are able to participate, what characterizes this description, the relationship between the Geon and the other scholars who have gathered according to this description of Nathan the Babylonian?
I think it seems very hierarchical. Like, it seems very official that the Gone is almost like testing them.
Yeah. So there's definitely, the Geon is is the one who administers the tests. The others have to perform. And I think you're right to use that word hierarchical. Again, as I said, part that I didn't provide for you here that described the seating arrangement in and of itself is very, very hierarchical. But what you do see here, certainly in the interaction between the Geon, very hierarchical kind of relationship. And this becomes particularly, I think, comes to the fore in a very prominent way when we get to the next paragraph of this text, which describes the way in which the scholars would use these gatherings for another purpose, and that was to write responsa. So let's read it together. This was their custom regarding responsa to questions. He, that is the Geon, would bring out to them all the questions which have arrived and gives them permission to respond. Right? The he, again, is the Geon. Them is all of these other scholars who have gathered during the Kala month. So he brings out, over the course of the half year, let's say, since the previous Kala, questions have been coming into the Geonic Academy. They've been gathered, they've been organized, and now during the Kala month, in addition to their regular Talmudic studies, the Geon presents these questions to the students, to the disciples, and gives them permission to respond. Then each one speaks according to his understanding and wisdom, and they raise difficulties and analyze it thoroughly. And the head of the academy hears their words and analyzes their words until the truth is clear to him, and immediately orders the scribe to write in response. Then they read the responsa and questions in the presence of the entire fellowship, and the head of the academy signs them, and they are sent to their addressees. Right, so this is a really interesting description, again, of the relationship and interactions between the Geon and the other scholars who have assembled, where the Geon is, in a way, similar to this pattern that has been set up by the regular study sessions, is in fact empowers the other scholars, the students, the so-called disciples, to engage with these questions that have been sent in and to offer their ideas, their thoughts, their analyses, their rulings. But ultimately, how does the response, the halachic ruling, get issued? The Gaon, again, collects all of these ideas and debates and suggestions that were put forth by the disciples. He uses that as the basis for his own analysis, but ultimately, he comes to the truth. He immediately orders the scribe to write his response. He signs and seals the response, and it is dispatched, right? So at the end of it, again, it's I think a relationship that accords with what we saw previously. On the one hand, this interactive fellowship, but at the end of the day, a very sort of hierarchical issuing of the ruling by the Geon. And this is the way that, at least theoretically, this is the way that the responsa were created and composed during this era where halachic authority was still relatively centralized in the person of the Geon, in the personality of the Geon. Now, what this missive does not, or at least in the passage that we've seen here, does not fully describe, is what were these questions that were being sent by the Geon? Who was sending them? How did they get there? What was the nature of the questions that were then being answered and dispatched during these Kala months? And to get a little bit of a better sense of what were these questions, I want to take a look at two examples. I should say that we have actually, the responsa of the Geonim were apparently collected at a fairly early era. We have today a decent number of these texts. Some of them we have because they were preserved in the writings of later scholars, and we're going to talk about the ways in which the responsa literature became canonical in and of itself and was, copied and transmitted by later scholars. But when it comes to the Geonic writings, we actually have a treasure trove of Geonic material, including responsa literature, thanks to the Cairo Geniza. And I'll have a lot more to say about the Cairo Geniza, but I assume that many of you are familiar with this really significant repository of writings of a wide array of natures, from canonical texts of Jewish literature to shopping lists and student scribblings that were found in Cairo, stored in the attic of the synagogue in Furst, which was Old Cairo, where the seat of the Jewish community throughout the medieval period. This was not meant to be an archive. This was really a kind of trash bin, but because traditionally there is a custom of not throwing out things, certainly sacred texts, but really any texts with Hebrew or even just Hebrew writing or even just Hebrew letters, much of this material was, again, kind of tossed into the attic of this synagogue. And really thanks to many historical circumstances, including the climate conditions in Fustat, much of it was preserved and kind of rediscovered by some significant scholars in the 19th and 20th centuries, including a tremendous number of the responsa of the Geonim. Partially because Cairo was one of the way stations in the kind of connections between the Geon and the various other diaspora centers during this era. The communities that looked to the Geonic academies as being the seat of Halakhic authority, this sort of centralized Halakhic authority that we saw described, and who would turn to them with these questions, right? So on their way back to the various communities from which they came, many of these texts kind of passed through Cairo, where they were copied, where they were preserved, and that's part of the explanation of why so many of them ended up in the Geniza. In any event, what we have here, what we're going to take a quick look at least, are two examples of Geonic responsa. Some of the Geonic responsa that we have are incredibly short, like sometimes as short as 1 or 2 words. Yes, no, right? That was the Geonic response. In other words, the Geon was so authoritative that he could just answer a question with that really very straightforward and not in any way elaborated answer. Many of the responsa are a bit longer. The kinds of material that they cite and discuss are primarily Talmudic. Sometimes the responsa of other Geonim, or the writings and rulings of other Geonim. But as compared to the responsa that we're going to see for most of this course, that is those from the medieval period, the Geonic responsa are characterized by being very definitive, very straightforward, very clear in their answers. We're going to see again how that changes in the medieval period. The one that we have in front of us, this responsum of Amram Geon, is one example of a Geonic response that I think does display some of those characteristics, although this is a unique one insofar as it was fairly long. This responsum was written, as we'll see, in response to a question that was sent to Amram bar Sheshna, who, as per the beginning of this responsum, you can see was the head of the school or the head of the academy, the Geonic academy at Mata Mechasya. And it was dispatched to Rabbi Isaac, son of the teacher, and Rabbi Simon. And we'll see that the questioner was in Spain, right? So this is already a period in which there are Jewish diaspora, there are diaspora communities, and diaspora communities that are kind of learned enough to have rabbinic figures of their own and to be interested in applying for and in receiving answers to halachic questions. Those were the questions that generated these responses. Let's take a look at it, and then we'll be able to get a sense of what the question was that generated at least this particular response. So again, Amram, son of Sheshna, head of the school at Mata Mechasya, to Rabbi Isaac, son of the teacher, and Rabbi Simon, beloved, dear, and honored by us and the entire yeshiva. Great peace from the mercy of heaven be upon thee and upon thy seed and upon all the sages and scholars and our brethren of Israel who dwell there. Accept greetings of peace from me and Rav Tzemach, the chief judge of Israel, and from the comrades and sages of the yeshiva and the members of our yeshiva in the city, sorry, there's a typo here, and of the city of Mechasya, and the sages and the scholars and the children of Israel who dwell here. We are ever seeking your welfare and remembering you in good remembrance and praying on your behalf and seeking mercy for you, that God may show you his many kindnesses and protect you and deliver you from all trouble and harm and sickness and pain and evil government and all types of destruction and punishment which come along in the world. May he and his great mercies fulfill all the desire of your heart. And the reason that these are, sort of, and we'll see this becomes even more prominent in the medieval period, these kinds of flowery openings, these greetings that were included in many of the responsa. The reason that I am, again, they're of lesser halachic significance perhaps, but they are significant for appreciating the nature of this genre and the way in which these correspondences really preserved, but I would even say created, the connections and the relationships between the respondents and those who turn to them with questions. Now, let's pick up from, again, about 5 lines before the end. Rabbi Jacob, son of Isaac, has transmitted to us the 10 gold pieces which you have sent to the yeshiva, 5 for us and 5 to the treasury of the yeshiva, which we have ordained and blessed you with the blessings that will be fulfilled for you and your seed for generations. And I want to linger here for just a moment, because I think that is an important seeming aside. But as far as appreciating the relationship that these Halakhic correspondences created and preserved between the different Jewish centers, it seems, and this is not the only evidence for the fact, that often when these questions were sent to the Gaonic academies, they were sent along with financial donations, right? They applied to the Gaon for answers to these Halakhic questions that they had, and they sent a bit of money, a bit of donations, a bit of support for the Gaonic academies along with the questions and the answers that they hoped to receive. And this was one of the ways, and so here we also see how this correspondence was one of the ways of cementing the financial relationship between the more far-flung, from the perspective of the Gaonic academies, at least Jewish diasporas, and the Gaonic academies themselves, the ways in which the Gaonic academies were supported by the communities of the diaspora, and also really cemented this sense of, again, kind of hierarchical relationship between the Gaonic academies that were considered still during this era really the seat of Halakhic authority, and communities like this one, as we're going to see, in Spain. Now, I'm continuing on with this text. Rav Amram goes on to write, as for your questions about the order of prayers and blessings for the entire year, which you have asked, and the answer to which they have shown us from heaven, that is the answer to which God has vouchsafed to us, we have decided to arrange and to give you answer according to the tradition that exists in our possession as arranged by the Tanaim and Amoraim. Right, so apparently the question that this community had sent, or this rabbinic authority, this rabbinic figure had sent to the Gaon, had to do with the order of prayers and blessings. And as a matter of fact, this is only the very beginning of Rav Amram's response. Rav Amram's response is much longer than what you see here, and it constitutes the first sidur, right? The first sort of fixed, really, record of the order of prayers and blessings of the day, of the daily rites, of the Shabbat rites, of the festival rites. It really constitutes one of the first, what we could consider sidurim, official records of that. Right, so if we have to characterize the nature of some of these questions during the Gaonic era, one thing that we could say is that some of them have to do with things like, this is an era in which things like the order of tefillot, the order of the prayers, are really just becoming fixed and kind of permanent in the different communities throughout the diaspora. And these questions were an opportunity for the Gaonim to assert their answers, their authority in these regards. And the assumption was that the answers were binding on all of Israel. We're going to see that too changes in a later period, but that seems to be the nature of the relationship during this era. I want to skip, we're not going to read through the whole rest of this just in light of the time, but I do want to draw your attention to the end of this passage, the very last few lines, where Rav Amram notes that some of his answer has already been given by Rav Natronai, son of Rav Hilai, the head of the yeshiva of Matmechasya, one of his predecessors, to the congregation of Lucena, Spain, through this individual named Rabbi Yosef, Light of Our Eyes. So again, it becomes clear that it is a Spanish community that has turned to Rav Amram Gaon for this question, and which is receiving its answer. There was already a prior relationship between this community and the Gaonic academies. This is really the era in which Halakhic learning, Talmudic learning, is spreading beyond Babylon to all of these Jewish diaspora communities. Primarily in this era, it's spreading westward through North Africa and then slightly upward into Europe through Spain. That's where the centers of rabbinic scholarship really kind of reach out during this period. And that's where the Gaonic academies continue to assert their authority through that. Now, in addition to questions about things like the order of the prayers, We know from the collection of Geonic Responsa that we have that there were questions about really very wide-ranging during this era, questions about things pertaining to basic halakha, but also, interestingly, questions that pertain to questions of theology and faith, questions that pertained to basic understanding of Talmudic passages, right? So, which in a later era kind of became the purview of the commentary genre, and less the focus of rabbinic responsa. But during this era, responsa were oftentimes written as a kind of commentary insofar as they answered questions addressed. This was an opportunity or a medium through which the Geonim answered questions addressed to them about basic understanding of Talmudic passages or basic understanding of Talmudic history. And the most famous of these is perhaps what is known as Igeret of Shrira Gaon, or the Epistle of Shrira Gaon. Shrira Gaon was the head of the Geonic Academy in Pumbedita, or actually by that point in time, the Geonic Academy that had formerly been in Pumbedita had relocated to Baghdad, but he was the head of that major academy over the course of the 10th century. He himself lived to a very old age, from about 906 to about 1006, a good 100 years. And he was the father of Hai Geon, who was considered the last of the great Babylonian Geonim. So this is towards the end of the era. But the Igeret, or the Epistle of Shrira Gaon, which is considered a classic of Geonic literature, was generated, as you can see here, by a question that was posed to Shrira as head of the Geonic Academy by the rabbis of Kairouan in North Africa, right? So we're talking again about an era where this is where the Jewish communities that had a relationship with the Geonic academies, that really cared, that saw the Geonic academies as the central halachic authority, this is where they were located. And the question that they addressed to the gate of the Metivta, or academy, to the Beit Din court of our master and teacher Shrira, the son of Hanina, the son of our teacher Yehuda, the questions that they asked were questions, as you can see here, about how was the Mishnah written? If the men of the Great Assembly began writing it, and parts were subsequently composed by the sages of each generation until Rabbi Yehuda the prince came and sealed it, then why is most of the Mishnah stated anonymously? What about the Tosefta? We heard that Rabbi Chia wrote it. Was it written after the completion of the Mishnah or concurrently with it? If the Tosefta was to include further matters, then why did Rebbe disregard these matters? What is the chronological order of the Savarim? So they're asking questions that are about halachic history. They're really asking for a history lesson. And in fact, Shrira Gaon's response is exactly that. And this is considered one of the really classic texts, classic claims regarding kind of the long Talmudic history. And we're not, again, we don't need to read the text together now. I'll provide you with the slides afterwards, and you can take a longer look at it, or look for some of the other sources of this text. But this is another example of the nature, the types of topics and content of the Geonic responsa literature. So if this was the era in which the responsa really took off, we see that during this period it was very, very wide-ranging in terms of what it addressed. But in the period that we're going to be focusing on most for the remainder of our course, the period of, as I said before, the Rishonim, the medieval period, the period that really stretches from, again, roughly the year 1000 through roughly the year 1600. So the period from the death of Hai Geon, which is often marks the end of the Geonic period, at least schematically, through the composition, let's say, of the Shulchan Aruch, and we'll talk more about that chronology next week. During this period, the period of the Rishonim, or the early sages, the early post-Geonic sages, this is where the responsa literature really, really gets its shape and form, and becomes a major genre of halachic writing. Again, we'll have many opportunities to see examples and to characterize and to appreciate the nature of this writing in depth. And I do want to say here as an aside that responsa literature is a source for many important aspects of halakha, halachic history, etc. It is also a very significant source for Jewish history, even beyond the legal context. And I have a lot more to say about that we'll delve into in the coming weeks, ways in which this type of legal literature can be used as historical source material. But to end off our session today, I want to address briefly the question of that became really a significant question during this medieval period. What halachic weight? What is the legal nature of this responsa literature as compared to other types of halachic writing? For example, the famous codes, right? What weight does it have from a legal perspective? How is a legal decisor, how is a rabbinic authority meant to utilize this literature in rendering halachic decisions? This is a question that the Rishonim began to really ask themselves, but it's a question that certainly pertains today as well, because if I didn't make it clear beforehand, this genre of halachic writing characterizes not only the Gaonic period and the period of the Rishonim, but really has become a staple of halachic writing all the way until very, very contemporary times. Today, we have responsa that are written thanks to the media of the day, on the internet, of course, in WhatsApp groups, and we can talk a bit more about that at a different time. So one way of addressing this question of what is, or one context in which the Rishonim address this question of the nature, the weight, the significance of the responsa literature from a legal perspective, was expressed in this question that was posed to Rabbi Joseph Ibn Migash. Rabbi Joseph Ibn Migash was one of the students of Al-Fasi. He was an important Spanish Rishon. And the question that was posed to him was, what does our master say about a man who never read the halakha with a teacher, does not know the way of the halakha or its explanation or reading, but he has seen many of the responsa of the Geonim and the law books, right? So in other words, we're talking about a person, and we're going to find out that this person is a judge, a person who doesn't really have great literacy in Talmudic literature itself, but he is familiar with the responsa of the Geonim. And our master, and this is what's critical for us, our master is not unaware that the responsa are not all of the same quality, especially the old ones that have been corrupted by the scribes, and some have been attributed to people other than their authors. And many of the Geonim would give a ruling in a responsa and then retract that ruling, or others disputed it. Can someone whose knowledge is mostly from these responsa and who does not know how to distinguish the correct ones from the incorrect ones give a ruling in a case? It's possible that the responsa he's using as his precedent was later retracted. Someone who doesn't understand the essence of the law and doesn't know its source in the Talmud, can he be a judge? Can we trust him? And it has been shown, I'm skipping down 2 lines, that he will give a ruling one day based on a particular Gaon, then give a similar ruling based on a different Gaon. Our master should tell us the law in this matter. In other words, we have this problem with the responsa literature, right? The responsa were answering questions in real time, but unlike the code, they weren't issued as kind of in a definitive way. They represented the answer of a particular authority, a particular scholar, to a question that had been posed to him at the time that he received it, at the time that he answered it. But quite likely, his mind changed later. He issued one ruling, he issued another ruling. How do we know that these responsa are definitive, that the particular responsum we or anybody is working with is in fact a reliable statement of the law? And again, this is, I'm kind of just opening up this question. We'll have to pick it up. But I will say that that the Migash, that Joseph Ibn Migash came down very firmly on the side of the responsa, suggesting that someone who has read the responsa of the Geonim is a better judge than many other people, right? In other words, people don't really know. People should not be relied upon to kind of read the source, the primary sources themselves, to know, to be able to wade through the Talmudic literature itself and be able to rule just on the basis of the Talmud. We need the Geonim, we need these rulings. And in fact, having the responsa literature under your belt is a very good way of addressing that. And I'll just close with this last passage. We're jumping ahead several hundred years. Rabbi Jacob ben Moses Levi Molin was an Ashkenazi Rishon, as you can see down at the bottom, lived in the 14th and beginning of the 15th century. But he too addressed this question of how reliable are responsa, how much weight do they have on a legal basis? And just very briefly, he says to his correspondent, the context doesn't matter here at the moment, you have written that one must not rely on the responsa, but the contrary is true. They are practical rulings. We can learn more from them than from codes because the authors of the codes were not present when the cases were decided. And the rulings handed down in responsa on the cases are all intended to be put into practice. So in addition to everything else we've said, here we see, and this is the general consensus, there was a lot of debate on this matter, as you can imagine, throughout the ages, but the general consensus is that responsa have a particular weightiness as far as halakha is concerned, because they are case law, because they are written in response to very actual, practical instances of halakha, of communities questioning and struggling, and in fact trying to put halakha into practice. I'll conclude here for now, since our time for today is up, but perhaps this will be a good point to pick up next week as we continue again our study and move into the main period that we're going to be focusing on throughout the class. So thank you very much for today.
Okay, thank you so much, Rachel. Do you want to give a minute just in case anyone has any
Sure.
questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Please. Anyone
So
who
if
has
anyone
questions
has
is
any
more than
questions
welcome.
right now, it's a great time. Okay. Looks like we're good. Oh, yeah. Okay. Looks like we're good with questions. Let me just make sure the Facebook. No. Thank you so much, Rachel, for sharing your Torah with us today. And thank you also to all the participants who joined us. As a reminder, this class is a part of a 9-week session. So we'll be together again next week and for following weeks. A few other announcements. Registration for Spring classes is open for other classes as well. You can go to 5784.drisha.org/spring to see all the classes. Many are starting today, including Torah and Technology, Ancient Wisdom for a Digital Age with Rabbi Daniel Nevins, and a special guest appearance by Rabbi Silber at Mishnah in Depth this Tuesday as well, today. And so I hope to see you there and in many of our classes here at Drisha, and we'll be together again next week. Lehitraot.